Hello, today is October 17th, 2016. My name is William Winkle. This interview is for the Detroit Historical Society's Detroit 67 Oral History Project, and I am sitting down with Mr. Frank Joyce. Thank you so much for sitting down with me today.
Thanks.
Can you please start by telling me where and when were you born?
Sure. I was born in Detroit in 1941, and my parents lived here until, and this is right away we're off into something that's a little fuzzy, but not that much. Sometime when I was quite young, they moved to Berkeley, Michigan. We left Detroit. And some people who read this interview may be familiar with Marcia Music's essay about the kidnapped children of Detroit. And I've said ever since I've understood that really important concept that she put out there that I was kind of a pioneer kidnapped child of Detroit. My parents were white flighters sometime in the late 1940s. So I started elementary school in Berkeley, and then at some point we moved from, I think I was still in elementary school, and they moved to Royal Oak, and so I finished school in Royal Oak and graduated from Royal Oak Dondero High School.
During that time you're growing up in the suburbs, did you come to the city or did you tend to stay in the suburbs growing up?
I've recently been writing something where I've been thinking about this. We came to Hudson's to see Santa Claus, as so many suburbanites did. And so I have some memories of that. Otherwise, I don't. And we came to baseball and football games. I remember that as a child. But one thing that's relevant to this project that I just remembered is, my grandparents lived on Ivanhoe in Detroit until some point in my childhood, and so we would come to Detroit to visit them until I was, I don't remember how many years old. They then moved to Texas. But one thing that I do remember is times that we would be in Detroit as a child, and we would be in what was then known as the ghetto. And my father making it clear, just by the condition of the housing that we saw primarily, that we were both better off than those people, and in some way, better. I remember that as sort of an early lesson in the culture of white supremacy. And similarly, as a child, I remember being on vacations and trips in rural areas in the South, where impoverished communities, rural communities, black communities, were pointed out to me as some sort of evidence of, white people being, again, not only better off, but better. And to digress on that for a minute, because, I've written a lot about race over the years and continue to do so. And I'm working on a new book now, in fact, that is not exclusively about race, but that's a big part of it. And this self-fulfilling prophecy nature of white supremacy, which is that you create a structure that advantages whites, and then you use the physical evidence of that advantage of proof that you deserve it. It's the born on third base but thought I hit a triple phenomenon that some people have used. And again, in a way, I maybe have more awareness and more conscious of this now in the last few years. We're sitting here in 2016. Even though I've paid attention to this stuff for a very long time now, I think a lot of things are becoming clearer to all of us about our sort of collective history, but even in my case, our individual history of how things work. So sorry for the long-winded answer, but...
Not to worry. So, having those little moments growing up where that was pointed out to you, when did that click in for you growing up? At what point did you become an active agent, say, against white supremacy?
Yeah, here's the hopefully short version of how that evolved. I was of a generation that I and others have characterized as rebels without causes, who found causes. As I mentioned, I graduated from Royal Oak Dondero High School. Well, in the class of '59, and as some people know, Tom Hayden graduated from Dondero in the class of '57, and there was clear evidence in Royal Oak at that point of this pushing against authority. Tom, for example, was involved with creating sort of a forerunner of the underground press, a publication called the Daily Smirker, which is a satirical publication that made fun of the school authorities and, things that teenagers like to make fun of. I was involved in a May Day protest in my senior year in high school. And it wasn't that we had a lot of political consciousness about race or much of anything else, but we were pushing these boundaries of authority. We were questioning authority, as became clear later. What I trace as my first overt political act was in the summer of 1960. I was driving down the infamous 8 Mile Road, and I happened at the intersection of 8 Mile and Greenfield, and I happened to notice a picket line, a demonstration that I couldn't really figure out what it was, but I was intrigued by it. So I made a U-turn on 8 Mile Road, and I came back, and I saw that it was a protest at a place called the Crystal Pool, and the protest was over the fact that the pool, remember this is 1960 in the North, that Crystal Pool denied admission to African Americans. It was a white-only public swimming pool in Oak Park, Michigan in 1960. And I said, well, that's not right. And so I joined that picket line. And memory is fallible, as we know, but I'm pretty sure that John Watson was on that picket line and others who came to be kind of prominent and early activists in Detroit. It happened that there was news coverage, television coverage of that demonstration, which my father saw on TV, either that night or the next day, I don't remember which, and shortly after that I was a homeless teenager, is how I characterize it now. But part of my rebellion was, in my own family, and part of it was in a larger context, but he just considered that like I had crossed some line at that point, and basically I got thrown out of the house. And I've told this story in writing and a few other times. The good news is that at that point I had a factory job, and I was economically in a position to be self-supporting. I was working in a factory part-time, going to Wayne State part-time. And so I was homeless for 2 days until I found an apartment, stayed with a friend at first, but had been pretty economically independent for quite a while before that. But anyway, that was a very explicit political act that somehow this racial discrimination resonated with me and kind of set me on my life course ever since.
And where did you go from there? So you're at the picket line and you see the consequences of picketing and protesting.
Right.
Does that inspire you to keep going?
It does. And I was going to school, as I say, part-time at Wayne State. I was working in a factory, but I had been the president of the student government at Royal Oak Dondero, and I was active in student government at Wayne State as well. And in that milieu, in 1960 and beyond, there was, of course, a lot of social ferment, and people like Kenny Cockrell and John Watson were students at Wayne State, and so I became involved. Well, I read an article in a magazine, the Reporter magazine, I believe it was, about an organization called the Northern Student Movement. The Northern Student Movement was founded by Peter and Joan Countryman on the campus of Yale University, initially as a group of college students supporting the Southern movement, and SNCC in particular. So we're not here to talk about the whole history, but the short version is I wrote them a letter. Didn't have the email then. I wrote them a letter, they wrote back. We came to be in communication. I went to a conference on the campus of Yale, and I founded what became the Detroit chapter of the Northern Student Movement, and also became active in the Detroit chapter of the Friends of SNCC. We were sort of a kind of an overlapping group. And NSM took on its own political evolution, but one of the projects that NSM did that I helped to start in Detroit was a tutorial program which brought college students into mostly elementary schools and other community settings in Detroit. It was a little like a Big Brother, Big Sister program. We would do after-school programs with young kids in schools to help with reading and so on and so forth. And that very quickly became a radicalizing process because I was engaged in Detroit, I was living in Detroit, I was going to school in Detroit, my job was actually in Ferndale. But I became immersed in Detroit, the city, which I hadn't known anything about as a kid growing up mostly in the suburbs, but also became radicalized by the tutorial project at understanding the segregation that existed in the Detroit public schools and the disparity between predominantly white schools, which there still were then, and black schools and so on and so forth. So this all became a part of a radicalizing process that continues to this day. Where were we? That set me off, and I've been a lifelong political activist ever since. One group led to another. I was active in the anti-war movement. I became active in the labor movement. I worked on the staff of the UAW for many years. I became involved in part of my growing up in that time and in that movement was the emergence of new media. So I was very early involved on the staff of the Fifth Estate newspaper. I was the news director at WABX, the sort of legendary radio station, not in the first wave of WABX, but later in the late 1970s. I was the news director at WDET for a while in the 1980s, then went to work in the communications department in the UAW, from which I retired 12 years ago now.
Popping back to the 60s, what were some of the, so you mentioned you were founder of the Northern Student Movement in Detroit.
Correct.
Friends of SNCC. What are the, did you do work with Acme?
Well,
66?
Yes. The Northern Student Movement had its own evolution and is a chapter in history that is underreported and needs to be written. But one of the spin-offs from the Northern Student Movement was that we continued to do these tutorial programs for quite a long time, but we also got engaged, not just in Detroit, but this happened in Boston, in Harlem, in Baltimore, in Philadelphia, in community organizing projects around issues of education, housing, police brutality, etc. And in Detroit, that took the form of helping to create an organization called the Adult Community Movement for Equality, known as ACME, which was located on the east side and basically headquartered. We had an office on Kercheval and sort of Pennsylvania, McClellan, that area of Kercheval. ACME became very quickly, while it had a pretty sophisticated political program, again around schools, housing, education, etc., we quickly became very involved in conflict with the police because the police very quickly came to see us as some sort of threatening radical influence in the community. And of course, this was in the mid-60s. We're in the sort of 64, 65 framework here. But by then, particularly as a result of the civil rights movement in the South, there was a lot of political surveillance going on, and ACME very quickly, and we knew people who came to be involved in what became the League of Revolutionary Black Workers and so on. So it's well documented how much police surveillance there was of what was perceived as radical activity in Detroit. And I brought with me today some recently unearthed to me files that have a lot to say about that police surveillance and that are police documents. I also have gotten some of my own surveillance files from the Detroit Red Squad, from state police, from the FBI, et cetera, et cetera. I like to say, I brag to my kids sometimes, that I have the biggest police file of any white guy in Michigan. Meaning that, of course, much more surveillance was devoted to black radicals. But partly because of my association with black radicals, I show up in a lot of these files as well. And so I was very immersed in all of the emerging movements in Detroit and elsewhere. I was active in the national leadership of NSM as well. The other thing that happened out of the Northern Student Movement, however, that's relevant to Detroit history is that before SNCC went through its famous sort of racial divide, at least a year ahead of that, the Northern Student Movement had our own conversation on the question of should white people be working in white communities? And so people like me who were involved in ACME and in the black community on the east side of Detroit, basically, and this was not an acrimonious or hostile debate, it was a genuine and serious conversation of, what's the best strategy here? And I was very persuaded that it made sense for white people to focus activities in the white community. So somewhere in this time range, 65, 66, we first created a group called Friends of NSM, which was basically the white people who had been active in NSM became Friends of NSM, both to raise funds and provide support for the Northern Student Movement, but also to begin to think about, well, what would it mean to craft a message and be involved in the white community? Friends of NSM evolved into an organization called People Against Racism, PAR. And PAR became an organization in its own right that flourished for a while through the late 1960s. We had chapters on college campuses. We had chapters in cities, literally from coast to coast, from Boston to Palo Alto, and places in between. And again, I think was a sort of more influential organization than the history books tend to give us credit for. That's partly my own fault for not paying enough attention to that, and particularly for not doing a good enough job of record keeping. But it turns out there's more records than I had thought at the Reuther Archives and elsewhere, and thanks to taxpayer dollars engaging in political surveillance, there's a lot of stuff in police files that's very helpful about the history of NSM and People Against Racism and other organizations. So more of that stuff is out there to be looked at by people who are interested than I had realized. But it gave me a sort of really rich opportunity to live in a very dynamic time and have this perspective of coming from the suburbs into the city, sort of eyes wide open, and really learn an enormous amount from what is sometimes called the up north movement, as well as engagement with people who are active in SNCC and Detroit Friends of SNCC, etc. I only in that time period went south one time, and that was to Selma in what is known as Turnaround Tuesday. The movie Selma does a halfway decent job, I thought, or a more than halfway decent job of depicting this. Many people know about the Selma to Montgomery March. They know about Bloody Sunday. But in between, after Bloody Sunday, there was a call that went out to people to come to Selma and show solidarity and attempt to march once again across the Edmund Pettus Bridge. And there was a big meeting in Detroit after Bloody Sunday, and funds were raised and volunteers were sought to go south. And my colleague and comrade and lifelong friend from Acme, Will McClendon, and I went to Selma as a part of that trip. The march itself, as history shows, was the march where those who showed up went to the Edmund Pettus Bridge again, where we were confronted with a massive display of force from the Alabama State Troopers. And at that point, Dr. King and other leaders were negotiating with the federal government for some sort of federal protection, which they by that time did not have. And so this was the march where Dr. King led people to the bridge, then stopped and prayed and turned around and came back, which was aggravating and disappointing to those of us who were there. But in any case, not knowing what was going to happen next, we returned to Detroit. And I just cite that as because virtually all of my political activism has been in the North while supporting the Southern movement, but as a larger proposition, I think also the movement in the North is also kind of underreported as a chapter in the history of the 60s.
Speaking of Martin Luther King, did you happen to march with him in '63 here?
I marched in '63. I met Dr. King when he was here, I believe, for one of his speaking engagements at Central Methodist. We had a situation at that point with, this is a great story, actually. I don't think I've ever told this story before. Within NSM at that point, because we were doing these tutorial programs and we were involved with a lot of young people in the schools, including high school students, and we were increasingly engaged. I remember we picketed the Neisner store, for example, in downtown Detroit over employment discrimination issues there. There was a lot of activity, to state the obvious. But we had a particular case where a really incredibly charismatic, for lack of a better term, young woman was very active in promoting the movement in her high school and had encountered enormous opposition from her parents, which is something I happen to know a little bit about. And so we knew that Dr. King was coming to town, and somehow we reached out to him and asked, would he agree to speak to this young woman's father? And he said that he would. So this entailed me meeting him at a church that he was speaking at, not at Central Methodist, riding in a motorcade with him from that church downtown to Central Methodist, sort of briefing him on what this situation was about. And indeed, the father had agreed to come, who wouldn't come to meet Martin Luther King at that point, agreed to come, and they did speak. And he never really became fully supportive of his daughter, but he didn't put up the resistance and opposition that he had before. And I had a couple of other personal encounters with Dr. King and other times, but that's like one incredible story that I remember. What year was that? I don't know. I'm going to guess. It certainly was after the 1963 march in Detroit. And I also attended the 63 march in Washington in August and helped, as I recall, organize a bus of people who went to that as well. So it's kind of a Zelig thing, you know. If it happened, I was probably there.
So you mentioned the pushback that this young woman was getting from her father. As you're protesting, as you're picketing around Detroit, do you getting pushback from other groups?
Oh, yeah. That's a kind of a loaded question. But yes, in particular, there was an organization called Breakthrough that sort of devoted itself to being the opposition. They would be the Trump movement of our time. They were part of the backlash and of the opposition to this push for civil rights and racial equality in the North. And I can't recall how many encounters I had with Donald Lobsinger and Breakthrough, but I do remember being on a television show once and describing Breakthrough as a parasite organization. This is sort of coming back to me as I'm talking about this, but I said, if we went out of business, they go out of business too, because their sort of sole purpose in life was to protest us and to hassle us and to show up at Grosse Pointe South when Dr. King spoke there, for example, and to try to disrupt that speech. There was another event in Grosse Pointe South that this was prior to Dr. King's famous speech there, but I don't remember some of the details of this, but I remember I was a speaker at the event and Breakthrough disrupted and tried to and were sort of escorted out. They did not succeed in destroying that event either, but it wasn't for lack of trying. The other group, of course, that two other sort of things come to mind when you ask about sort of the opposition. In addition to Breakthrough, one was, of course, the police, and that was particularly focused on Courchevel and relative to Acme. But, at any demonstration we had anywhere in Detroit, there was a massive police presence and there was massive police surveillance. But the other organization that I would cite as having been incredibly hostile to the movement was the Detroit News, a tradition which continues to this day. Nolan Finley is one of a long history of white editors of the Detroit News who have tried to put the brakes on sort of any and every effort to bring about any sort of progress, but was particularly antagonistic and hostile on issues of race. I know this is on the record, and I've said it many times before, so I don't mind saying it now. I've characterized Nolan Finley, who, for those of you who don't know, is currently and has been for many years the editor of the Detroit News now, as white supremacist chief spokesman Nolan Finley, because he has routinely, and I'm talking about modern, current time, 2016 and over the last several years, however long he's been there, he has been incredibly hostile to African Americans and incredibly hostile to change and incredibly denigrating toward African Americans. And I remember an editorial he wrote, which I quoted in something I wrote and which has now been deleted from the Detroit News website, in which he basically said, well, the reason we need an emergency manager is that black people are not capable of governing themselves. Again, this is not ancient history. This is within the last few years. So it's kind of, there's a big fog machine that sort of is, I think, confuses a lot of people about how the mechanics of institutional racism and institutional white supremacy works. But the Detroit News has been a bastion of opposition for as long as I can remember in my lifetime in this town.
So, in speaking about the opposition you faced from the Detroit Police Department, could you speak a little bit about the Courchevel incident in '66?
Sure. As I said earlier, Acme, and thank goodness for a woman whose name is Nancy Melio, who wrote a book called 9210 Courchevel. And Nancy was a social worker who was active in this very same area, and she created a Moms and Tots Center, which was considered very radical in the practice of social work at that time. And a little digression here. Aaron Krasner, known as Ike Krasner, was a faculty member at Wayne State University in the Department of Social Work, and was himself an activist and radical in this time, and helped to make Wayne State University a center of radical new thinking about social work. To be honest, I don't know that Nancy Melio even went there, but I want to give Ike Krasner some credit and some recognition here for what he did. She was a nurse, and as I say, she created this Moms and Tots Center that had a very complicated relationship with ACME. We were, sort of dealing with the same constituencies in some cases. In any case, she came to publish a book about her experiences on Kirchhoff. And thank goodness, a lot of her book is about ACME, and she reproduces some of the documents that ACME produced, including a kind of manifesto, if you will, that sets out a quite sophisticated program addressing, as I say, education, health, and the whole gamut of issues of institutional racism. But the thing that came to define ACME's existence more than anything was this conflict with the police. At one point, they came up with some pretense they raided the ACME office and sort of tore things up and, destroyed things and took documents and so on and so forth. And on a daily basis, there was this sort of police presence, and there was at that time a unit of the police known as the Big Four, which was always four big white men who rode around in big Chryslers and who basically contended for control of the streets, is the way that Will McClendon, who was one of the leaders of ACME, and I would put it. And they did this all over the city, and they did it in every city in the United States, and they still do it in every city in the United States. But what made it different in the context of ACME is that it always had this very clear and defined political edge. Do people call you Bill or William or
Billy?
Billy, okay. So this was a source of constant conflict, and ACME, as I look at this now, we certainly did some things that I'm sure they found deliberately provocative. We picketed police stations. I remember one time we organized a little, a sort of yippie-like intervention. They were doing an open house at the 5th precinct. I get the 5th and the 7th mixed up sometime. But anyway, it was the precinct whose headquarters at that time were on Jefferson, at Jefferson and Connor. And so we kind of invaded the open house. And I remember one of our members, Moses Wedlow, who was an extraordinary guy by any measure, sort of took over giving guided tours of the precinct and said, so this is with a little room they put you in when they're going to beat you. And we completely disrupted this sort of goodwill community outcome. And I cite that just because it's kind of a fun story on the one hand, but also because it was evidence of this, we messed with them, they messed with us. So come to the time of the Kirchhoff incident in 1966, this was, for which I was not physically present, by the way, but this led to an encounter that sort of, I guess from the police's point of view, got out of control, in which they pride themselves of, over a 3-day period, having gotten back under control again. And let me stop there and see if you have a follow-up question or where else you want to go with this.
Well, so still speaking about Kercheval, who were some of the other major Detroit activists that were involved, say, in the Kercheval incident?
Well, of course, the local activists were Will McClendon, Moses Wedlow, Clarence Reed, a number of other names. But part of the notoriety of the Kercheval incident is that General Baker and Glanton Dowdell, who at that point were very prominent African-American activists in Detroit themselves, were stopped on, I think it was the second night of the incident, on their way to Kercheval, and a number of weapons were found in their vehicle. So I think that that's important because there is this debate, which I've weighed in on in many ways and many times, about was it a riot, was it a rebellion, was it civil unrest? And my argument, in part, that it was a rebellion was that in the case of Kercheval, at any rate, everybody involved knew that these were overtly political people. You can say, for example, of a blind pig on 12th Street a year later in July of 1967, well, that was just sort of the day-to-day tension and struggle between the police, between mostly white police and black citizens. But you couldn't say that about Kercheval, because ACME was known to the police, had an office, was a political organization, and was already in a kind of medium intensity conflict with the police. I was pleased to read recently Hubert Locke's interview for this project, and Hubert and I had a long history, and I have great respect for him and for the work he did and the effort that he made in the city. But I noted that in his interview about the Kercheval incident, and others have made the same point, for all of the pride they took, and boy, did we know how to handle this, and we put on this overwhelming display of force, and so, we contained this. He gives a lot of credit to a massive rainstorm that took place on the third night of what was going on, and that sort of swept everybody, the cops and everybody else, off the street. Had that rainstorm not happened, might there have been a different outcome? Well, obviously, we'll never know. We do know, however, that whatever significance is attached to the rainstorm, it was because of Kercheval that, from Mayor Kavanaugh to the police commissioner and everybody on down, there was this confidence that we know how to handle this. Other cities, Newark, other places, this may get out of control, but we have proved, and we've trained, and we've learned, and we've equipped the police to make the kind of presence and so on and so forth that can contain, conflict once it starts. And I think hardly anybody disputes that played a role in them kind of misunderstanding what started on 12th Street in July 1 year later.
How did did your work change after the Kercheval incident? Was there a sense of worry going forward that the police were going to be more openly antagonistic towards you?
That's a great question. I think that we thought they probably couldn't be any more antagonistic than they were already. But we also, a couple of other things happened kind of at the same time. For one thing, of course, Will McClendon and Clarence Reed were charged for inciting a riot, and we became involved in their legal defense in the immediate aftermath of Kercheval. And they were, I think, unjustly convicted. They both did, in Will's case, quite a bit of time. Clarence's not so much. But it would be fair to say that we were, in a certain way, put on defense from that point forward in a way that we had not been previously. And that did have a disruptive effect on Acme and its ability to sort of do what it was there to do. At the same time, personally, I was going through this transition that I mentioned before of shifting into what do we need to be doing in the white community and what kinds of programs and organizing and educational materials and so on, because that was the period of the evolution first to Friends of NSM and then to People Against Racism. So my own attention was shifting more towards People Against Racism. I also was becoming more involved in the anti-war movement at that point. And I remember very well the conversation within People Against Racism about the war, because it was a formative experience for us. And we developed position papers, and we had a long conversation in which at the end of which we said, this is a racist war. We must oppose, if we oppose race, if we are people against racism, we must be against this war. And the grounds for believing that the war in Vietnam was a racist war was twofold. First, we felt that this kind of death and destruction and brutality was a continuation of the racial practices that we were coming to understand that went with slavery, that went with genocide against the indigenous people of the United States. And that that this war was not going on against white communist countries. The allegation in the case of Vietnam, or the cover story, if it will, was, well, we're stopping communism. Well, why don't you go stop communism in Poland? Why don't you drop napalm on the Polish people if you think that that's the way, if that's how you have to achieve regime change? Mm-hmm. So we thought the war was racist on those grounds, and we thought the war was racist because we understood that black and brown people were experiencing a way disproportionate impact of casualties, of being killed and injured in the war. So all of these sort of threads were converging in 1967, in that year between from 66 to 67, both in my own personal life and in how the movement in Detroit and around the world was evolving. So somewhere in there, I don't know that I could put even an approximate date on it, but somewhere in there, Acme kind of fell apart. Now, keep in mind that as a result of CONINTELPRO and as a result of police surveillance and intervention, none of the organizations of the 60s really survived. Not SNCC, not SDS, not the anti-war coalitions sort of lasted more into the early 70s. But I have long maintained that too little attention is paid to, I have to say it, the success of political repression, the success of intervention and arrests and assassination, obviously in the case most notably of Malcolm X and of Martin Luther King. But as too few people know, scores of civil rights activists, particularly in the South, but not exclusively in the South, were killed by vigilante groups, by the police, et cetera, et cetera. Well, it's funny, when we want to go make an intervention in some foreign country, we often cite the repressive machinery of the state as stifling dissent and free speech and democracy and so on and so forth. Well, it works. And the evidence that it works is you don't have to go to some country in Latin America or Africa or Asia to prove that. You can go to the United States. And that did begin to have an effect. I've written about this. We had our own internal problems. I think we weren't prepared to deal with the level of repression. We didn't understand U.S. history. We didn't really understand what we were up against. And there were other flaws that I can look back on now in terms of what our philosophy and our goals and objectives were. But we for sure were not ready for the level political repression that we encountered. So I have the short answer, some summary to that is that AFSCME kind of fell apart.
Okay. Before we get into 67, so during the year before 67, what was the state of, say, left-wing activism? Was in Detroit, was it a cohesive group, or was it multiple groups working towards the same goal but independently? Because you mentioned you've worked with John Watson, you've worked with General Baker, you worked with Will McClendon. Was it a unified group?
Well, I would say it was sort of all of the above. And what I mean by that, I'm not trying to be cute, is that I think Detroit is a special place, and I think the history of the movement in Detroit, if for no other reason than the importance of the League of Revolutionary Black Workers coming from Detroit, but for a lot of reasons, and because of the history of Detroit preceding the 1960s, because of the labor history of Detroit and the deep roots of political struggle, and particularly the black community in Detroit that go way, way, way back. I think the Detroit movement had a vitality and an energy that was important and extensive. But I think we also had all of the political contradictions that were to be found both in the national movements and so on. The most important of those contradictions, and again, I've written quite a bit about this, is that I think the movements of the 60s themselves never overcame the racial divide. So I think you had the, quote, white movement on the one hand, which was SDS and the women's movement, and a big part of the anti-war movement, and then I think you had the civil rights movement and the Black Power movement and the League of Revolutionary, the name was League of Revolutionary Black Workers. And it's not that those things didn't overlap and intersect. White people went to the South, obviously, and I, as a white activist, was very engaged with the League of Revolutionary Black Workers. And I mentioned earlier, later in that process, when Jim Foreman left SNCC and came to Detroit, because this is where the League was, and he and I taught a class together. So it's certainly true that there was, however you slice it, there was some contact between white activists and black activists. That being said, there were organizations that were overwhelmingly white and other organizations that were overwhelmingly black. Well, even more, as my own politics and understanding has evolved to this day, I understand that we have I sometimes call it eugenic capitalism, I sometimes call it race-based capitalism, I sometimes borrow Jim Lawson's phrase, plantation capitalism. We have a kind of particular animal that we are dealing with here, not just in Detroit and not just in the United States, but the history of colonialism on a global basis that requires and compels us to understand the power and the dynamic of race. And I think we tried hard in the 1960s to do that, but I don't think we got there. I think we didn't understand it from an analytical point of view as well as we can now, and we certainly didn't understand it from an organizational point of view. And I can go on and that, and I have in writing, and I will some more, but we don't have all year here.
So going into 67 and then going into the summer of 67, were you and other activists anticipating anything in Detroit? Watts has happened, new work is going on. Are you anticipating that there will be an uprising in Detroit?
That's a great question, and I don't know that anybody ever has asked it exactly that way before. I think that we certainly thought it was entirely possible. How could we not? I mean, we had particularly those of us who had been, very directly involved in the Kercheval situation and who knew how volatile things were and who knew and I'm sure there's things in writing that maybe you've already looked at or whatever, but whether in the South End or in things that the Clays were publishing at that point, no one was under the illusion that this cover story of Detroit is different because things are better here, and because we're sort of the poster child for liberal policies and model cities and so on and so forth. We knew that was all nonsense. And we knew that, 1 millimeter below the surface was conflict with the police, was racial segregation, was institutional racism. So that the possibility that at any given moment something could break out was in our minds. But I don't know that anybody sort of specifically predicted that what was going to happen would happen. None of us were surprised, that's for sure.
How did you first hear about the incidents going on at 12th and Claremont?
What a story. So, I was not in Detroit at that point. I was in London, England, attending something called the Dialectics of Liberation Conference with Stokely Carmichael. And you can look this up. There's websites that talk about the Dialectics of Liberation Conference. And there's some accounts of from people who were there of sort of me and Stokely and some of the things that went on in that regard. And I honestly don't remember sort of the sequence here, but somehow, news accounts began to make their way into the international media of the time. The Dialectics of Liberation Conference, by the way, was this radical gathering of activists from all over the world, including from the United States, that itself had a sort of an interesting take on, where are we at in this point of history and so on and so forth. But at some point, with all due respect, and I really mean this to my friend Hubert Locke, as I recall it, he didn't tell us in his story, but at some point, Hubert Locke reached me in London and said, because of Courchevel and other reasons, said, do you know what's going on here, and do you have any ideas about anything we could do about it, was sort of the way I remember it. And I said, well, I'm, sort of vaguely aware of what's going on, and, this would have happened whether I had gotten that phone call or not, but I said, I'm coming back to Detroit. And I remember, this was easier to do then than it is now, but I remember changing my flight, and the earliest flight I could get, it still took me any number of hours before I could rework whenever I was, but I came back to Detroit early. By the time I got here, of course, things had escalated to an incredible degree, but I remember that People Against Racism, which is my sort of primary organization at that point, started to organize, and I remember we had a meeting at a church in Royal Oak, and we established some sort of outpost, as I recall, at Grace Episcopal Church, where Father David Gracie was located, who had been a longtime supporter of the movement, to bring people together to talk about what was going on, to try to figure out whether there were supplies that we could raise that people need who were being dislocated and so on and so forth. So I was sort of, up to my eyeballs in it. But at that point, there certainly was, the Detroit police no longer had any interest in talking to me, and I didn't have any interest in talking to them either. But it's just a funny little footnote of history, getting that call from Hubert. A parallel story is that I was still, at that time, the news editor of the Fifth Estate newspaper. So one of the other things that happened as things were still smoldering is that I was still the news editor of the Fifth Estate at that point. And as a result of people that I knew on the East Side, I was told of a story about, which turned out to be basically a story of a National Guard assassination of a young man whose name I remember to this day, John Leslie. And so I got to work on a story about sort of the brutality of the police and in particular the National Guard during the rebellion. And the Fifth Estate published a story which was referenced actually in the Fifth Estate exhibit that was done here at the Detroit Historical Museum, a front page story called Who Killed John Leslie? And Peter Werby and others at the Fifth Estate and I are still proud of the fact that we think before the Free Press got into investigating what happened at the Algiers Motel and so on and so forth, we were really the first publication to raise and document a story about this incredible brutality and repression. And perhaps others have said this as well. I think it's widely understood in some circles at least that our interpretation, even at the time, with what we knew in the moment, was the main reason that the 82nd Airborne came to Detroit was to control the National Guard. It wasn't necessarily to control the population, because the National Guard was out of control and basically the police were out of control at that point. And who knows how many more people would have been killed had it not been for the 82nd Airborne, which had brought, I'm not saying any of us would have called to bring the 82nd Airborne into Detroit. By the way, a side note, the law that had to be used to allow the 82nd Airborne to participate, to be deployed domestically, was specifically a law about insurrection. And I cite that in terms of this ongoing debate about rebellion or riot, because the law sort of anticipated exactly, well, maybe not exactly, but a situation like this as a time when federal troops could be deployed domestically. In any case, not only were they a far more disciplined fighting force, obviously, but there were a lot of black people in the 82nd Airborne, and there were not a lot of black people in the National Guard at that point. That was an overwhelmingly white organization in Michigan. And as I say, but for that fact, probably even more people would have been killed than were killed, and of course all of whom were killed by the police. Anyway, the story of who killed John Leslie is something I'm proud of because it was at least shining a tiny little light on, well, let's look at what was the conduct of the police and the National Guard and the federal troops in this. And it's an old story in U.S. history, of course, that the military is created in part out of fear and anticipation of slave revolts going all the way back to slavery, and of course of having to clear territory and otherwise deal with indigenous Americans. So there is this continuous line throughout our history that is a part of my mission to this day continues to be to help white people understand that. So I don't know where that leaves us, but
so now the 82nd Airborne has come and the rebellion has been put down, essentially.
correct.
What effect did... I have a couple of effect questions. So what did the effect of the rebellion have on your activism?
Well, it didn't diminish it in any way, that's for sure. I think, again, the organ is my primary sort of base at that point, kind of in addition to the Fifth Estate, was People Against Racism. And we became even more active, and it became even more apparent to us that institutional racism was a very powerful and brutal force in American life. So we continued to do the work of People Against Racism, and at that point, as I say, we had active chapters in a number of cities and on many college campuses. I think it's fair to say that I've not thought about it this way until now, but I think it's fair to say that in the same sense in which 1966 was maybe the beginning of the end for ACME, maybe 1967 was the beginning of the end for People Against Racism, because in part, I think we got, there's this drip, drip, drip isn't the right expression, but there was this relentless political repression and surveillance and so on. We were a right group, so we weren't experiencing it the way Black Panthers or, SNCC or anybody like that was. But we still knew that even for the kind of work we were doing, there was a lot of opposition. And of course, we previously referred to Donald Lobsinger and to Breakthrough, but these kinds of organizations are a permanent feature of American political life. We happen to be living in a time, they ebb and they flow. We happen to be in a time of the presidential campaign of Donald Trump, which obviously is capturing a lot of this, I want my America back again. And there's no, we know what people mean there's a left-wing version of I want my America back again too, by the way, but the right-wing version of I want my America back again is we want white people clearly in charge. And that's what that's all about. I cite that just because obviously post-67 in Detroit, the anti-war movement is still gathering steam at that point. But personally, I think it's fair to say that even within People Against Racism, we began to pay more attention to the war as a focal point of our activities, for better or for worse. Not even entirely sure why that happened, but part of why it happened was that was still a growing and very dynamic component of the movement. So, in any case, were there people in that period who dropped out of politics? Well, nobody that I knew. I think maybe people did get burned out, and people sort of did take a break from politics at various points along the way. But I don't know. I was as busy as ever.
You've touched on it at a couple points in the interview so far. The term rebellion. And why you use that terminology. Could you go in depth with it for a couple moments? Sure.
I've already said that I think, don't take my word for it, take the government's word for the fact that it was a law about insurrection that was used to, create the legal justification to send the 82nd Airborne to Detroit. I've also said that in the context of the Kercheval incident, that was a conflict between an overtly political organization and the police, and it had a long history before August of 1966 and a history after that. But also, I've talked about the fact that, and I think for white people in particular, this is important to understand, language does matter. And the investment that a lot of white people have in calling this a riot is precisely because they don't want to concede that black people had anything to rebel about. And because the characterization of this as criminal activity, as opposed to political activity, fits the whole ideology of white supremacy in the first place. Because whites perceive blacks as an underclass, a criminal class, etc., and going all the way back to slavery, the demonization of black people, in order to create a moral justification for slavery and for the oppression and segregation and exploitation of black people, is at the core of the identity of the United States of America. And that's hard for people to accept, it's hard for people to hear, it's hard for people to understand, but that doesn't mean it's not true. And so this debate, riot versus rebellion, this argument over a word does not take place in a vacuum. It takes place in the context of this. Interestingly enough, fast forwarding to the present for a minute, so now we have the film Birth of a Nation, and there's a growing understanding and a better understanding of African American history and of the fact that the institution of slavery has always faced resistance from black people, but that resistance has also always been distorted and mischaracterized and demonized in and of itself. And so again, there is this continuum from whether you're talking about Nat Turner or Denmark Vesey or some of the episodes leading up to and during the Civil War of mass black desertions of blacks joining the Union Army. I could go on and on about some of this history, but the importance of it is to understand that this is a linear process. We've been having this argument about rebellion versus riot since the 1600s. And it's as important a conversation to have today as it was then. I'm actually encouraged that we're in a new wave of scholarship and in a new kind of conversation about race. And you know, I've been doing this for a long time, so I find some of the things, for example, some of the programs that the African American History Museum is doing here. Well, let's stop and hit the pause button for a minute.
Oh.
There hasn't always been an African American History Museum. It is the cumulative effect of this movement and of the civil rights movement, for example, creating spaces in colleges and universities for scholars to do African American studies, white and black scholars, I might add, and to produce new work and better understandings of our own history, whether you're talking about 10 years ago or 100 years ago or 400 years ago. We are better positioned to, I hate the term conversation about race, but partly because we've never not had a conversation. We talk about race all the time, and we have from the beginnings of the slave trade been talking about race. And white people talk about race all the time, and white people talk about their fear of rebellion and their fear of uprisings and their fear of revenge and of justice. And, you know, I can speak as a white person of a certain age. I've heard variations of well, what if they started treating us the way we've treated them? It's not like white people don't know what's happened here. They know deep in their heart and their head what has happened, and they have a lot of fear, and that is also a big component of this. We have to call it a riot.
Mm-hmm. Wow, thank you so much.
I have a follow-up to that.
Part 2, the Frank Joyce interview.
Well, we were on a little tangent there, but let me stay on the tangent for a minute because it fits with another point that I want to make. I have long singled out the Detroit News for its prominent and particular role as an advocate for and defender of white supremacy and racial privilege and racial segregation and the attitude that, you know, white people are better than black people and more deserving than black people and so on and so forth. And I think one cannot understand either sort of how did we get to the point of 1966 and 67. And I think I haven't said this yet, but I do consider 67 starting in Kercheval and 66 starting in Kercheval and 67 to be one continuous event. It just happened to last about 340 days and continues in its own way to this day, because it's not like this conflict is over with or is resolved. In any case, I think the Detroit News had a particular role to play in creating the conditions and attitudes in Detroit that preceded 66, 67. But I think they continue to play that role. And in particular, and it actually, this is a good segue into the other point that I want to make. One of the other arguments that I make for how do we know it was a rebellion, not a riot, is by reverse engineering what happened after the rebellion. And I compare what happened to Detroit, and I use that term on purpose, after 1967 to what happened to Haiti after the Haitian uprising in 1791, if that's exactly the right year, I think it is. And what I mean by that is that Detroit was punished, and that the fears of white people, which always just below the surface are of rebellion, are of uprising, are of revenge, and fear motivates white attitudes in a way almost as much, maybe as much in 2016 as in 1616, 1716, and all the years in between. And it is this notion that deep down inside we know that what we're doing is wrong, and that, whether it's Christianity or whatever, that somehow, somewhere there's going to be a price to be paid for this on the one hand, and on the other hand, there's this notion that we must keep a lid on this. We must punish those who rebel. So all of the known slave rebellions, for example, Denmark Vesey and Nate Parker and so on and so forth, they were all hunted down and hung. And the communities, whether it was the church or the neighborhoods or the communities from which they sprang, were punished too. We have this notion of collective punishment, which is that, okay, we're not saying everybody did it. Not everybody went into a store on 12th Street and, took a TV set or whatever. But in order to see to it that this doesn't happen again, we are going to reassert our power and our control militarily. And so, for example, and I wrote a piece about this shortly after the rebellion, the Detroit Police Department, we hear today a lot about police departments being weaponized with surplus weaponry from the Pentagon and from war. Well, in Detroit, shortly after the rebellion, at taxpayer expense, not because the Pentagon was giving anything away for free, a bond issue was passed, which was used in part to buy heavy weaponry for the Detroit Police Department, military personnel, carriers, assault weapons, all kinds of other stuff, and I wrote about that at the time. But that, in a way, was only the half of it, because as hostile as suburbia and as outstate Michigan might have been to Detroit, as it was becoming a predominantly black city, all of that hostility greatly intensified after 1967. And you see that play out certainly in the state legislature again and again and again, very dramatically on the question of regional transit, for example. We're facing a ballot proposal about creating a regional transit authority, and it will be, I believe, number 27 in a series of regional transit proposals, every one of which up to now has been defeated. I'm optimistic about this. I think it's evidence of the fact that some things maybe have changed here. But the 26 defeats are a dramatic example of this attitude of we do not want to do anything that facilitates interaction and transportation between black Detroit and the suburbs. And as you may know, but others may not, I remember not that many years ago, Walmart wanted to build a store in Livonia. And people militantly opposed Walmart's building a store in Livonia, not because of the reasons that Walmart meets a lot of antagonism, it's bad for small business and so on and so forth. People explicitly stood up and said, if there's a Walmart in Livonia, black people will work there and black people will come here to shop, and we don't want that. And this notion of rigid residential and economic segregation between the suburbs of Detroit. I mean, white flight, of course, is what made Detroit a predominantly a majority black city in the first place. But once white flight had taken place, the notion that was crystallized so clearly and repeated only recently by L. Brooks Patterson, that what we should do with Detroit is build a wall around it and throw in the blankets and corn, characterizes for me not the only response, but the predominant response to 1967 of hostility, of punishment, of control, of antagonism. And glibly people say, even Nolan Finley will say this, we live in a racially polarized community. Well, we sure as hell do. But it takes certain kinds of behavior and certain kinds of attitudes and certain kinds of legislation and certain kinds of practices on the part of white people to create that polarization and to keep it in place. And those forces are still very powerful. I think they're not as powerful in 2016 as they were probably in, 1969. But they are baked into the institutional and power arrangements of our society. And in that sense, and Thomas Segru, of course, is one of many who've written about this, but in that sense, they continue to be baked into the institutional arrangements and into how we talk about race in Detroit to this day.
Wow, thank you.
Thank you. Wrap it all up and tie a bow around it.
A few more questions first.
Sure. Okay.
So I asked you earlier how the rebellion affected your work. How did the rebellion affect activism in Detroit in general? Did you personally see an uptick in, say, organization or activism?
Well, to refer back to something I said before, it's hard to sort of separate out, okay, what was the impact of the rebellion versus what were these other sort of macro forces that were in play. And that by the end of the 1960s, for example, SNCC and SDS and all of these organizations, with something of an exception, as I said, for the anti-war movement, were beginning to crash and burn for a variety of reasons. Certainly, rebellions were a national phenomenon from Detroit to Newark to Watts, et cetera, so that plays into the national mix here. Certainly, the intensification of the war in Vietnam and Laos and Cambodia. At the same time, the intensification of the anti-colonial struggle in Africa and in Latin America as well were part of kind of the big picture forces that were in play here. The other thing I think it's fair to say is that I don't care whether you're talking about the labor movement in the 1930s, for example, or even the Civil War for that matter, things run in kind of waves and phases, and they sort of run out of gas, and then things are more dormant for a period of time until, for whatever reasons, these things happen. The period we're in now with Black Lives Matter, for example, and other organizations that are reframing and re-energizing these political conversations. I include the Bernie Sanders campaign in that, for example. So we're in maybe a pre-movement or early movement time again, but how much weight to give to political repression, how much weight to give to other things, things did kind of run out of gas. Even the anti-war movement, which I stayed active in until the very end, in which I've, a year or so ago, co-edited and published a book about. Even the anti-war movement basically ran out of gas in 1973, at the time the Paris Peace Accord sort of officially ended U.S. participation in the war. Now, we know the war didn't really end until 1975, but certainly by 1973, the anti-war movement was out of gas as well, except for some, diehard people like me. And there were diehard people in all of these movements who continued on, and, one of the things when I talk to young people today, which I, of course, very much enjoy doing, is nobody told me when I was your age that you should start thinking about this as the work of a lifetime. But it is the work of a lifetime. And the overwhelming majority of people who were active in the 60s are still active in some way or other, obviously not as intensely as they were. But there's a real core of people like me who sort of, we zigged, we zagged, we had kids, we had families, we did some other things, but we continue to be politically active. So anyway, to try to sum that up in a slightly more coherent fashion, I just can't sort of pinpoint where in the winding down of that movement the rebellion fits.
To you, is there a difference between the organizations that blossomed before the rebellion and after? Say, SNCC fell before the rebellion, and then is there a difference between, say, SNCC and Ad Hoc Action Group or DRUM or the League of Revolutionary Workers? Was there a strikingly different tone to their work compared to the work in the early 60s?
I really don't think so. I'd love to have a conversation with somebody who disagrees, but I see that more as evolutionary, not some, big break and then we started over. I think that we all were learning things at the time. In retrospect, we clearly didn't learn enough. As I said before, we really were naive about a lot of things. And we were naive in part because, using this term in really the broadest possible way, we were a new left. And it's not that we didn't have some connections to the Communist Party and to some of the key organizations of previous struggles and previous movements, but we were in part rebelling against them too. Well, what that meant, and there's an upside to this as well as a downside, but it meant that we were sort of figuring it out on our own. Now, amongst organizations that I think doesn't get the credit it deserves in American history is the Communist Party, and I was pleased to see R.D.G. Kelly has recently written a book in which he talks about this. But particularly on the issue of trying to form organizations and movements that could bring blacks and whites together in the workplace and communities and so on and so forth. The CP was trying to do that, and had no small success at doing that. For a very long time. And of course, they paid a price as well. And of course, there's a bigger story to tell there. But no, I think, let me just think about it personally. There's a lot of continuity in the evolution of my own political thinking over 50 years. And, it's a mosaic, and every piece of it fits somewhere. I think, for example, I give a lot of credit to initially Jimmy, and then more so Grace Boggs. But I think as their political thinking evolved, and as they brought us to a point of understanding that we need to take a fresh look at how this society is organized, and what one that was, to use Arundhati Roy's phrase, what a better world might look like. I think, again, Detroit, in many ways, leads the way in this of not being stuck, of not being doctrinaire, of being able to step back from our own movement and look at what did we do right, what did we do wrong, and more importantly, what do we need to be doing now. But it is, there's many threads, but I do see it as, a sort of whole piece of cloth, if you will. In some ways, just a specific point, because picking up, reacting to the ad hoc committee, in some ways, some of the work that we did attracted more support from whites after the rebellion than it had before. And in its own way, that goes to my argument about rebellion, because it wasn't just that the response of the white establishment or whites in general was 100% repressive. Again, go all the way back to slavery and go all the way back to the Indian Removal Act, or pick any symbol you want of the genocide against indigenous people in the United States and elsewhere. There are always some whites who are saying more carrots, less sticks. And to further mangle that metaphor, I think that we began to see some resources that were available, some from foundations and from wealthy individuals and from other organizations who kind of got it and said, the root of this problem is segregation. It is economic exploitation of African Americans, and we need to address that part of the problem too. So that didn't prevail. The bad guys won out, and the punishment and control people were more powerful than that. But there was a liberal response for sure.
And speaking about Detroit groups in particular, you mentioned how groups were burning out and sputtering out.
Uh-huh.
What was the lifespan of Detroit's hardcore political groups?
Well, I don't know if Sheila talked about this in your conversations with her, but of course one of the things that was important to Sheila and me and a lot of other people was what is known, we're getting really into the weeds of history, but was what is known as the split in the Motor City Labor League. Because one of the things that emerged in that period was out of Drum and what became the League of Revolutionary Black Workers and so on, was a multiracial organization that was sort of trying to build on what had we learned and what had we organized up to that point. And it created very successful programs such as the Control, Conflict, and Change Book Club, for example, which I've been trying to recreate ever since. One day I'll succeed. So that goes to the point earlier of a sort of how after the rebellion there was even more energy and more organizing and more activity going on. But how much of this might have been in part exploited by CONINTELPRO or the police or whatever, we began to encounter serious political differences about ideology, about strategy, about Marxism, about many of these questions. And so there was an organization called the Motor City Labor League. It divided in a very bitter conflict, and I think did contribute to the demise of at least a significant part of the Detroit left. So, and it would be wrong not to mention that, and I'm glad you brought it up because that certainly played a big role.
Another very loaded question. Do you think that the quote-unquote shadow of 67 still hangs over the metro area?
Oh, absolutely. Very much so. When I wrote my piece in the Free Press earlier this year about riot versus rebellion, I had that very much in mind, and I started that piece with saying something like, it's a part of the summer ritual, because not a summer has gone by since that anniversary isn't marked. It's like 9/11 or Independence Day or something. This metropolitan area pays attention to 1967 on every year ending in the number 7. And I'm sort of fantasizing out loud here, but maybe we'll know we've made some real progress when a year goes by and nobody does that. But it is a part of the summer ritual here, and I say that to say that the riot versus rebellion debate, you know, it's like a smoldering ember and the flames shoot up all over again. So in that sort of narrow way, it continues to cast a shadow. But in a broader way, in a far broader way, as a result of what has been done to Detroit, as I was saying earlier, the destruction of the Detroit public schools, for example, emergency management, bankruptcy, the distortions of the tax code that are punitive towards Detroit. The question I mentioned earlier of the isolation of Detroit by the refusal to create a regional public transportation system. I could go on and on and on. But in those ways, very directly, we are still in the shadow of 1967 for sure.
Well, thank you so much for sitting down with me. Is there anything else you'd like to add?
God, I don't think so. Of course, on the way home, I'll think of 5 things, but
I'd be happy to sit down with you again.
Okay.
Thank you so much.